So I don't know how common this experience is, but when I was a kid, I feel like there was a very specific trope that showed up in a lot of kids' shows that went something like this. You'd have one character who either is an artist already or is trying to get into art, and another character who's kind of dumb and loves to eat. At some point, the dummy would go into the artist's workspace, see an apple, and try to take a bite out of it, only to spit it out upon realizing that it was a wax sculpture that the artist had made or was using as a reference, and the real apple was often just out of frame. And that was important because the joke doesn't really work otherwise. The point is to show that the artist is very talented by putting the wax apple and the real one side by side and making it indistinguishable until some dummy takes a bite. And also that the dummy isn't all that dumb for getting tricked by a convincing fake. What makes him a dummy is that he didn't really think about the context that he was in. If he had, he might have thought, hey, this isn't really a place where you often find fresh fruits just laying around. Maybe I should double check with someone about it. It also arguably shows that he's a bit inconsiderate because he just saw some food and decided to take a bite without asking who it belongs to. So in a way, it's a bit of karmic comeuppance. Anyways, today I want to talk about what happens when you're the dummy who bites the wax and falls for some fake fruit. Also, I don't think biting the wax is a real expression for falling for queerbaiting, but it 100% should be if it isn't, and if it is not already, I want the credit for it if it becomes one. So, the inspiration for this video came from, as you might have been able to tell from the thumbnail, a game called Buried Stars. Buried Stars is a visual novel about the top 5 contestants of a Korean singing competition show getting trapped alongside a PA when the stage collapses. And 2 of the characters, Do-yeon and Gyu-hyuk, have a very interesting relationship, we'll say. This video will spoil a fair bit of the game, but I'll try to keep specific spoilers limited to things that happen in the first route or the non-canon bonus horror route. And I would highly recommend playing it for yourself because it is excellent. I also have a whole other Buried Stars video if you want more on it, and if I'm lucky, I'll be getting to make some more down the road soon too. Anyways, at the beginning of the game, Do-yeon throws himself at Gyu-hyuk to save him from some falling rubble, and Gyu-hyuk helps to pull him out of it afterwards. The two share a very interesting relationship with each other that, to me, and to just about everyone who's ever played the game or watched the VODs, card in the top right if you're interested, reads as some degree of romantic. Like, here's just a sample of the comments I've gotten on those VODs and also on the Buried Stars video that I made that I mentioned earlier, card for that in the top right as well, and like, these bitches are gay. The whole thing gives the vibe of like, we have these feelings, but now's not the time to really dive into that. Their producer's just been killed in the collapse, there's someone threatening to start killing more of them, Haesung Seo's being a brat like always, the list just goes on and on. However, ultimately, they aren't gay. Or at least, they're not canonically confirmed to be gay. Sexuality doesn't really come up a ton in Buried Stars given their circumstances and the short timeline that it's taking place on. But that doesn't mean you can't read between the lines and interpret it that way. Now, the reason this inspired this topic is that, to me, it brought up an interesting question about queer coding and queerbaiting. Namely, what does it mean to fall for it? What happens to us and our relationship to the media we consume when we bite the wax? How does it affect our perception of others who either do or don't notice that it's wax when they bite into it? Is it actually wax in the first place? What even is queerbaiting? All of that and more will be tackled by yours truly, a hopeless homosexual who manages to consistently be cognizant of the queerbaiting he's exposed to and still fall for it on the basis of, but what if it is real this time? Also, before we start, quick plug for the Viveros Wiggler pin pre-orders. We're almost up to the 25 needed for the campaign to succeed, so if you're interested in getting a wiggly little guy of your own, make sure to check out the top link in the description to get one all for yourself. And now, on to the actual video. Part 1. What is queerbaiting? So, first of all, we should establish what queerbaiting is. The basic definition is just what it says on the tin. It's baiting the queers into enjoying a piece of media by putting allusions to queerness into that media but never actually diving in. Typically, this would look something like 2 cishet men or women being put into a compromising position together, sharing some meaningful looks that could mean nothing but maybe it's gay, sharing some moments of intimate friendship that could be read as romantic even though it's ostensibly platonic, etc. We can see all these with Do-yeon and Gyu-hyuk, who my autocorrect keeps trying to call Guy Hyundai. They have a lot of conversations where the tone is very, "You're special to me, you know that? Different than the others." They both are each other's main confidants in the story, and they have multiple compromising CGs together, most notably this super gay one at the end of the game I will not be providing context. In the game's first ending, again, spoilers ahead, but like I said, limited to the first ending. Also, some self-harm stuff if that's a concern for you, skip ahead, I'll put the times code on the screen. It is an absolute bloodbath. Somebody bashes Haesung's head in the bathroom. Sale gets impaled on an exposed pipe and dies, Jaeyoung gets crushed in the rubble, and eventually, Gyu-hyuk has a breakdown. He walks off and hangs himself on the stage with his tie, and when Do-yeon finds him, he snaps too and kills himself the same way with the same tie. It's a lot. Tragic Doomed Gaze is a very easy reading of Buried Stars when it comes to those two. I should also probably mention it here before we get too far in that I'm mostly going to be focusing on queerbaiting in relation to queer men, because that's the area that I'm just most familiar with because I keep falling for it. Queerbaiting with regards to trans identities or queer women is a different story, both because the dynamic is very different and often very fetishy compared to MLM queerbaiting, and I don't tend to really fall for that because it's not something I look for super hard. That doesn't mean I don't care about queer characters that don't match my specific identity or that I don't want them in games, just watch my 100 line streams whenever Darby starts losing her mind over Hiriko. But within the context of this specific discussion, we're focusing on falling for queerbaiting as a member of the audience. And that kind of requires you to speak from a perspective of having bought in substantially enough that it turning out not to be queer would have had an impact. Some of this stuff is applicable across the board, some of it isn't, but since this video will predominantly focus on that perspective and use male examples, I wanted to establish that up front. However, we should also establish what queerbaiting is not. For one, it's not when there's actual gay shit happening and it's just not to your taste. Heartstopper is not queerbaiting. How to Get Away with Murder is not queerbaiting. Even if the gays are being cynically written to draw in more gays, it's not really queerbaiting if they're actually gay. At that point, the correct term would probably be either pandering or pinkwashing depending on context. It is also not the right term for a character who, in universe, is canonically faking their sexuality to trick someone or entice a queer character. Queerbaiting also, importantly, requires some degree of intentionality from the author. It doesn't apply to a scenario where they didn't intend for it to come across as queer at all and it's just a fan conception or a fan interpretation, such as Cassidy and Hanzo in Overwatch. Like, there's not really much queerbaiting or queer coding happening there. Everyone just wants to see them fuck, and they're desperately trying to manifest it. Queerbaiting requires a deliberate decision on the author's part to try and entice a queer audience in with a very noticeable suggestion of queerness, and to keep dragging it out, but never actually intending to do anything with it or going back on it. Queerbaiting is also not queer coding, and it's an understandably difficult distinction to notice sometimes. Queer coding is using cultural signifiers of queerness, whether stereotypical, caricaturized, or realistic, to communicate something about a character. Historically, something evil. Think Disney villains in the 90s. Queerbaiting often uses queer coding, but with the added specific intent to draw in queer people without actually wanting it to be queer. Queer coding itself can be incidental or accidental and is more about how the character will be interpreted and understood by a cishet audience member, whereas queerbaiting is something deliberate and is done with the goal of appealing to a queer audience member in a way that won't offend the cishet audience member, or which is plausibly deniable in order to have your cake and eat it too. There's also an important difference between pandering and queerbaiting, a subtle, difficult one to identify, but a relevant one nonetheless. Namely, pandering is usually unapologetically trying to say, "Hi, I'm gay, please acknowledge that I'm gay," and have the gays enjoy it because it's gay. Inescapable Sasha falls into this camp. The goal of pandering is to bring in the target demographic, in this case queer people, but the downside is that people who don't like that target demographic, in this case homophobes and transphobes, might respond negatively. Queerbaiting is an attempt to, again, have your cake and eat it too. To make it gay enough that queer people will buy in, hoping for representation, or at least to see something that they can relate to in that way, but never in a way that would alienate that bigoted audience, or even just an audience that might prefer a different ship or something like that. Pandering, while still shallow representation done for profitability and popularity, is still arguably better than queerbaiting, which doesn't even offer shallow representation. Queerbaiting is a performance of the illusion of representation, and it works especially well for queer people compared to other marginalized groups because queerness is a lot more ambiguous in terms of how it presents. Now, where we hit a fun little roadblock is with discussions of real-life people, and it's a discussion that I do not think most people are very good at having. Theoretically, yes, a real-life person can queerbait. They can present themselves as being queer and make allusions to it when they aren't with the goal of attracting a queer audience. Katy Perry's I Kissed a Girl isn't the kind of thing we're talking about here. That is a piece of media produced which itself is queerbaiting, but we're talking about people who are accusing Shawn Mendes of IRL queerbaiting just by being a twink they're attracted to. However, the appropriate application of this in the real world is very narrow, because real-life people are autonomous creatures not designed for a narrative purpose like fictional characters are. A fictional version of Shawn Mendes would potentially be understood to be queerbaiting depending on the story that's being told, but Shawn Mendes as a real-life person is not queerbaiting just because he's hot and gay men thirst over him. In fiction, an author might write a character of Shawn Mendes in such a way that he does queerbait by making allusions throughout the text that the reader can't know for certain, but which is deliberately meant to entice a queer audience. But in reality, there is no definitive narrator or author who can tell us unequivocally what is in Shawn Mendes' heart. Real human beings are complicated, confused, confusing, and in a constant process of organic, messy, personal, public, professional, and private development. This video is going to focus exclusively on fictional characters because, frankly, I don't think the internet is at a place where they can handle that conversation responsibly. Hell, the internet's already fighting for its life to try and figure out how to handle JoJo Siwa. Anything more complex or nuanced would lead to a miserable comment section for me, so I don't want to do that. Anyways, with that said, let's move on to the juicy stuff. Part 2. Through the Looking Glass. Queerness in Retroactive. That is such a dumb niche reference for a title. I'm so sorry. Anyways, one of the challenges with queer representation is what I mentioned earlier. Queerness can be represented in pretty subtle, ambiguous ways, and it's hard to really know what to do about it. Like, I've been joking that I fell for queerbaiting in Buried Stars, but what makes situations like Gyehyuk and Doyeon so difficult to just either accept or dismiss out of hand is that it is very plausible and fair to read them the way that I and many others do. There is a genuine affection between the two that goes beyond the friendship that both of them demonstrate towards both the other men in the group, Haesung and Sale, as well as the women, Jeong and Inha. Doyeon's narrative is that he was a shy, reserved musician whose band entered the competition only to have the producers tell him that if he wanted to continue, it would have to be as a soloist without his band. Gyehyuk is the son of a famous musician who abandoned him and is implied to have hordes of screaming female fans that he shows relatively little interest in. The two of them care about each other a lot, shown right from the jump with how Doyeon was willing to die to save Gyehyuk when the stage collapsed. Again, spoilers for Buried Stars ahead, but nothing that would ruin it for you. There are several ways for Gyehyuk to die in Buried Stars, and if Haesung survives the assault in the bathroom, Gyehyuk will kill himself in the same way he does in the first ending, hanging by his tie on the stage. Gyehyuk's death is treated as one of the only necessary conditions for a truly bad end in a game where Doyeon is the protagonist, and the good end, if this game can be said to have one, is one where he lives. What's more, Buried Stars has a fun bonus horror route that you can unlock if you beat the main routes. I say fun, but I am horrible with horror, and it truly is a fight for my fucking life to play it at all. Gyehyuk wandered around mumbling in the dressing room. His gaze followed him. Oh god! Something zoomed past his eyes.
방금 뭐지?
Oh. Guys, I don't like it. As I'm writing this, I don't know how I'll get the footage for this bit. Maybe I'll just get some screenshots from somewhere. We'll see. Like, truly can't stress enough how stressful it was for me. When I played it, I had to take 10 minutes to recover from a very mild jump scare. Anyways, when you play this route, the characters get picked off one by a mysterious supernatural force. Eventually, that strange supernatural force takes over the body of Gyehyuk, and you get to have a conversation with the monster. Part of that conversation involves a piece of dialogue where Doyeon can ask why it appears as Gyehyuk, to which the monster responds that it took the form most pleasing to Doyeon. Which, sure, that could mean nothing, but also, that's incredibly gay. It doesn't say the form that would bring you the most peace, or the form of your closest friend. It is specifically a form that is pleasing to Doyeon, and it's implied to be pretty much only visual. After all, the monster can't really replicate Gyehyuk's personality. It doesn't try to reflect any of it. It's just an illusion to lure Doyeon in. And I think it's a pretty fair read to say that that's meant to be an indication that their relationship does run deeper. The monster's inside Doyeon's head as well, battling to lower his sanity enough that he can take over him as well, so it knows what he's thinking here. One of the challenges with identifying queerbaiting is what I said before, that queerness can present in very subtle ways, especially in an environment that isn't conducive to a discussion about crushes or romance. Buried Stars takes place in a crisis setting, so of course there isn't really a lot of time for Doyeon and Gyehyuk to talk it all out. There are dead bodies all over the place, and more of them are emerging. And yet, you still see all these little hints and indications. And sure, they could mean nothing, but they're also not there for no reason. Analyzing implied or subtle queer representation in the moment is tricky because unless a character just says they're queer outright, you kind of need to wait until they've gotten through the full story before you can make a confident assertion one way or another. Moment to moment in Buried Stars, it can be hard to tell. Once you get to the end, you can look back and analyze everything as a whole, and once you do that, it's hard to deny that it's not at least queer-coded and they never push back on that reading. And that's the first step in this whole process, identifying if some gay shit might actually be happening. Check for smoke before you start looking for the flaming homosexuals. The next step then is to analyze intent. If it's too subtle to call it pandering, then we're stuck somewhere between queer coding and queerbaiting. An important distinction that I left out earlier is that queer coding doesn't inherently mean that something or someone, isn't queer either. Queer coding can be used to indicate a legitimately queer character's identity by employing stereotypes or signals of queerness when explicitly communicating it doesn't work for whatever reason. Queerbaiting doesn't work like that. The character either is not queer or is being locked in an authorial closet. They are not allowed to be queer even if they are when they're queerbaiting, or else it defeats the purpose, and it can be hard to tell until it's all over whether or not that's what's actually happening. Then again, does it really matter? Part 3. Death of the author and melting of the wax. I have a canker right on the tip of my tongue, and it is killing me. TH sounds are not my ally right now. Anyways, ultimately, our working definition of queerbaiting relies on an assumption that the author gets to decide details like this. that authorial intent is what matters most in reading a character, even if that intent contradicts things that the author themselves included in the media. If a character is written to walk like a duck, talk like a duck, and look like a duck, does the author get to unilaterally decide that they're actually a goose in spite of what they themselves wrote? Queerbaiting assumes authorial intent supersedes authorial action, that what is written is less important than what was meant by what was written, and that the author themselves gets to decide which authorial actions are true or not, such as deciding that the character declaring their heterosexuality is the true statement and the queer coding was not. However, it's also important to distinguish between two types of queerbaiting: confirmed queerbaiting and unconfirmed queerbaiting. Confirmed queerbaiting would be a scenario where the author does declare a character's heterosexuality or cisgenderness to the audience in contradiction to the queer coding and or queerbaiting presented earlier in the narrative, whereas unconfirmed queerbaiting would be a scenario where the author deliberately leaves it vague and never declares an identity for the character either way. The former is honestly just hack writing. It's J.K. Rowling shit, and a sign that an author is either not very good at what they're doing or is running away from what they previously wrote for some reason. They queer coded a character and then declared them non-queer, which is queerbaiting, but is also just kind of lazy work. The latter, however, is where we tend to get a lot of the discourse when it comes to queerbaiting, the long con of trying to constantly bait the gaze along without ever confirming or denying it. And in these circumstances, authorial intent can be a lot more difficult to discern, which makes it all the more complicated. If their intent is for the queer-coded character to be queer, and the author makes the decision to not explicitly confirm it for one reason or another, maybe it's for a sequel, maybe it's part of the character's arc that they're not identifying themselves as such at this point, or maybe part of the theme of the story is unspoken truths and hidden secrets, cough cough buried stars. Then, is it queerbaiting? Well, no, but we don't know the author's intent in this scenario, do we? This creates what I'm deciding to call Schrodinger's homosexual because I think it's funny, and I'll explain by bringing it back to Buried Stars. The theme of Buried Stars is, overall, focused on how the characters try to bury their secrets, and they don't like to confront them. They're all running away from something in their past. Ji-young's running from her past idol life, Inha from something that she just doesn't want to get into, Do-yeon from the betrayal of his band, Sale from his failure as a contestant and subsequent crash out, Hae-sung from being falsely smeared for attacking another student, and Gi-hyuk from his neglectful celebrity father and troubled childhood. Throughout the story, there are constant bits of dialogue between Do-yeon and Gi-hyuk where they demonstrate a closeness for one another that goes beyond what they share with the other characters, including a lot of close, intimate conversations. They clearly hold a lot of sway over one another as well, with Gi-hyuk's death being the one that will most dramatically affect Do-yeon, the monster in the horror route possessing Gi-hyuk's body because it knows it'll appeal to Do-yeon, and a few key scenes that I don't really want to spoil too much, but which collectively paint a pretty comprehensive picture of two men with something going on. And yet, it's never confirmed. They don't passionately kiss at some point or declare their love for one another. They also never express any actual interest in any of the women around them, either their fellow competitors or their fangirls. But what does that actually mean? This is complicated because the narrative is over a very short period of time, just a single night and only a few hours of that night in particular, and there's a series of bigger crises going on as well. Like, the stage has collapsed on them, their producer has died, someone's impersonating her, threatening to kill more of them. Like, there's a lot happening here. There's never really a moment where they could have organically had that conversation, or even really have the time and space to explore those feelings in the abstract, And this is again complicated by the fact that, while the game has multiple endings, very few of them leave both characters in a position to talk out their feelings. And this isn't a bad thing, to be clear. One of the risks of going after queerbaiting with too heavy of a hand is that I think we can easily mistake nuanced storytelling for evasive storytelling, or interpret an author's decision to leave a character's feelings or fate ambiguous as a decision to deliberately try and have their cake and eat it too. In the case of Do-yeon and Gi-hyuk, I think their story is aided by the fact that they are queer-coded and that this dynamic does exist between them and that it's never resolved. The way they talk to each other gives this feeling of peering into a relationship that we know nothing about, but which they clearly do. They aren't performing it for an audience, so they're not going to talk about themselves and each other like that. They're two people who are talking to each other who don't need to be quite so literal. However, this is also what creates the conditions for Schrodinger's homosexual. They are both queer and non-queer until someone with the authorial authority to do so finally opens the closet. And when you think about it, this sort of scenario is what comes up a lot when we're talking about queerbaiting. There's that infamous meme of getting queerbaited by Danganronpa is like losing at chess to a dog, but like, are you always getting queerbaited there? Is there nothing really queer happening? Because Karaka does, in fact, write a lot of very fruity characters, particularly in the 100 line, who build off of some very similar narrative tropes to Danganronpa characters. Danganronpa in isolation feels like queerbaiting to some, but with the context of how he writes more explicitly queer characters, I think it becomes harder to tell. In the 100 line, you have situations like Edo and Takumi, where one of the game's 100 routes ends with them sleeping together, or at least includes that happening. A situation which is complicated for approximately a billion spoiler-related reasons, but includes things such as Edo being literally nice, and Takumi potentially having no idea what being gay was, or that it was even an option until Edo climbed on top of him. And it doesn't stop with them. You have Yugamu, who is constantly talking about how cute the boys are, and you have Darumi, who's basically non-stop begging for Hiroko to step on her. You have Nozomi and Moko, who clearly have some sort of a vibe, and you have Takamaru, who just seems to be Kodaka's answer to, what if Mondo Owada from Trigger Happy Havoc was a homosexual with the aesthetic sensibilities of a coked-out interior decorator from the 80s? He is, I believe, the only male character who will respond positively if you give him a pair of skimpy leopard print briefs, and he loves the gaudy, tacky aesthetics of The Last Defense Academy. I rest my case on that one. On the flip side, you have Persona. Kanji in Persona 4 and Yusuke in Persona 5 are pretty unambiguously queer-coded, but Kanji's like the definition of what we talked about just a little while ago about making a queer character, but then inexplicably being like, JK, they're definitely straight. Yusuke's a bit more ambiguous, even if he is clearly queer-coded, but Kanji's whole deal is that he is gay. That's his whole insecurity. His shadow in the Midnight Channel sets up shop in a gay bathhouse. He has an exaggerated gay voice with it. Like, it's really not ambiguous at all. What's more, with everyone else's shadow, it reflects a truth about themselves that they were hiding. But Kanji's kind of the exception. His shadow is actually meant to represent him needing to come to terms with his complicated relationship to gender norms and expectations, as well as wanting to feel loved. And if he can't feel loved normally, then he's like, well, what if I find a guy? But like, that's a lot of mental gymnastics to avoid making the obviously gay character gay, right? And this one is honestly pretty textbook queerbaiting, and it brings up the question of not just authorial intent or death of the author, but whether or not the text should be accepted as an authority if it so transparently contradicts itself. Then again, that kind of brings us into the realm of fan fiction and fan canon. What is canon? What is pure fan fiction? And where is the boundary drawn? Yusuke is one where I think it's valid to argue that all evidence points to at least same-sex attraction being on the table, but Kanji is outright queerbaiting to such an outrageous extent that I think it's honestly valid to hold on to the belief that the truer version of his story is the one where he actually is gay in the way that the story was written up until the end of his little palace, whatever. I don't know what they're called in Persona 4. I can't remember. It's been a long time. Yosuke in Persona 4 and Ryuji in Persona 5 were both supposed to be same-sex romantic options for the protagonists as well, and those files can be unlocked via modding. It's cut content, but it was clearly intended to be there. And while the final scenes aren't there, there are some very obvious leftovers from those storylines throughout the narratives. What do we do about those? Are Yosuke and Ryuji queerbaiting? If you enjoy the ship, are you being queerbaited, or are you just enjoying shipping? I would argue that in addition to stuff like intent that we've already talked about, for it to be truly queerbaiting, it also requires some degree of canonization. That fanfic or fan canons that decide that characters are queer outside the narrative, like Hanzo and Cassidy from Overwatch, don't count as getting queerbaited because there's no real narrative trap that's being set. Yosuke and Ryuji with their respective protagonists are debatable. Yusuke by himself feels like he's probably queer but just not declared, and Kanji is just egregious queerbaiting by a writer who seems to write an awful lot of homosexuals for someone who doesn't like gay people that much, apparently. But then again, is it queerbaiting if a cishet character just doesn't perfectly align with their stereotypical gender roles and traditional ways of expressing their sexuality? Or if they are questioning, if they aren't sure, and then they come to a different conclusion? Like, is Maddie Morphosis queerbaiting? If a cishet male character is more feminine, or a cishet female character is more masculine, is that queerbaiting? After all, it's just not super constructive to the goal of progressive media critique and analysis to just impose rigid constructs of gender and sexuality in the name of sussing out the real fruits, is it? Kanji is queer-coded, and I would argue is queerbaiting, and I don't think it's hard to make that argument, but a lot of the characterization of him that's used to create that image is based on that sort of stereotyping. You know, that he likes to knit, and he's a soft boy, and that's used by Persona 4 as part of the queerbaiting. But should it be? Same goes for Yusuke. His voice, mannerisms, and way of expressing himself is very queer-coded. But what does it say about us that that's how we interpret that? Does the authorial intent in using some outdated stereotypes contribute to queerbaiting? Or queer coding? Should the audience be operating based on the author's assumed understanding of these issues and their perspective on it, or should we be bringing our own understanding, our own perspective to it? And can we kill the author at all? Authorial intent is clearly relevant, but to what extent? What part of the author's intent matters most? The part where they wrote a queer character, or the part where they said JK Kanji's straight? What does it mean to fall for queerbaiting when it feels like establishing what is or is not queerbaiting in the first place is such a complicated question? Because it's just not accurate, obviously, to describe every instance of queer coding as queerbaiting, and it's not like anyone really wants every single character in media to stop what they're doing and announce their sexuality to the audience just to make sure there's no ambiguity. especially because sometimes the ambiguity is narratively important and really interesting. But does that just mean that none of this means anything? Part 4. Am I just coping with getting queerbaited? This video stems from the way that I felt after playing Buried Stars and seeing how Doyeon and Gi-hyuk were portrayed, and in my heart of hearts, I truly do believe they're in love. This is the challenge of fiction, though. At some point, the story ends, and we're left with a finite set of words, pictures, and sounds to work with when it comes time to analyze. There is a defined limit of that universe to investigate, and that can be frustrating, especially as someone who really likes to do media analysis. And I don't think that I'm just uncritically deciding every character is gay or whatever. There is a logic that I'm following here. It's not even like it's just about who I'm attracted to or wanted to be able to romance in a given game or something. Sylvain in Fire Emblem Three Houses is straight, and I am at peace with that mostly. But Claude, to my eyes, is clearly bisexual. Haesung is straight-coded in Buried Stars, he's just a brat, but Gi-hyuk and Doyeon feel like they're at least into each other, if nothing else. Yosuke's queerness is ambiguous at best if you ignore cut content and the fact that he is the most homophobic gay man alive. But with Kanji, it feels legitimately galling that man has been basically retconned by his own narrative into heterosexuality. Meanwhile, Ryuji is, and I say this with love, probably too busy eating crayons to grapple with his sexuality in any meaningful way, whereas Yusuke has been queer-coded to such an extent that it feels really noticeable that nothing's ever done about it. The analogy of this video has been to compare real fruit to wax fruit as a stand-in for queer representation versus queerbaiting. But it's not just an arbitrary analogy that I came up with no deeper meaning. The question of, is this fruit real fruit or wax, comes with the assumption that this is in a context in which it matters in the first place. I mean, yes, if you're trying to eat the apple, the difference matters to you. But what if you're trying to capture the image of an apple, either through drawing, painting, photography, sculpture, or whatever else? When it comes to a video game, if you see an apple on a table, does it matter if it's real or wax in universe to you? If you were never told the difference, would you ever be able to definitively say one way or the other? To you, it's an apple. That's what matters. It's communicating its appleness to you. Is there really a meaningful difference between the two in that context? And to a large extent, the answer comes down to that fundamental question of queerbaiting versus queer coding. Queer coding is just a wax apple sitting there, indistinguishable from any other apple. In a story not related to that specific character's romantic life, or where it doesn't really get integrated or it's not really part of how that game works, it doesn't really matter if the fruit is real in some pure and true confirmed way. They can be queer-coded, and even queer, without it needing to be explicitly addressed. In fact, sometimes I would argue it's better that it's never acknowledged explicitly. Doyeon and Gi-hyuk's dynamic is engaging and fascinating to me in part because it isn't clear that they'll ever get to have that conversation with each other, and because what I perceive as unspoken feelings between them makes their choices and actions so much more impactful. That's not to say that I don't want queer characters to be explicitly queer, to be queer, but that sometimes it is more valuable narratively and for a character's perception to leave some of those details ambiguous. I don't think Buried Stars would be a better game if they stopped and had a conversation about how they're in love, or Doyeon confessed and Gi-hyuk said that he always felt the same way. I think that part of what makes it stick so hard and why I'm still thinking about it well over a year later is because of that question mark. But that's not really what we're talking about here, is it? Queerbaiting isn't when there's just a wax apple sitting there neutrally, where someone might be tricked into thinking it's a real apple, but no one's actively encouraging it. Queerbaiting is when there is someone or something explicitly encouraging the audience to perceive the apple as a real apple despite knowing that it's wax, and encouraging them to take a bite. Or, I guess in this analogy, embrace the character's queer representation. When it's unconfirmed, it's like the author lets you want to bite the apple, but never actually lets you bite down to confirm whether or not it's wax. When it's confirmed, a la Kanji, it just feels so disappointing, like the author is just relishing in getting away with deceiving you. In cases like Gi-hyuk and Doyeon, I don't really think it's queerbaiting, and I don't think that the authors are encouraging you to take that bite explicitly in the way that Kanji was, you know? It's more like they're showing you a fuzzy image of a round red shape that kind of looks like an apple, but it's out of focus because there's another primary subject in the shot that's being focused on. The goal is to communicate a unique relationship between the two men that influences how they proceed through their journey, without that being the focal point of said journey. And how you specifically interpret that relationship is not essential to the narrative so long as you recognize that it's there. That's all they're trying to communicate with you in that scenario. They're trying to communicate the importance of that connection. And where you take it from there is up to you. And in a scenario like that, the authors are deliberately handing that discussion over to the audience. Compare that to kanji, where it feels like you were deliberately encouraged to bite the wax. You feel betrayed and deceived and manipulated by someone who wanted to bait the gaze without actually giving us anything meaningful. And it sucks especially hard for something like Persona, where like it's such a long game. All of them take ages to beat. So once you start on that arc with the character, it might be a double-digit number of hours before you actually get to the point where they're not confirmed. Or you might get to the end of the game, dozens of hours later, and still not have an answer. But the problem is that both of those can feel like queerbaiting, because you just want that release of finally biting an apple and tasting that juicy flesh. Even if the purpose of the apple isn't to be eaten, even if it's not the focal point, that doesn't mean that you won't ever still want to take a bite. Even if you never actually take the bite with Doyon and Gihyuk, it can feel like queerbaiting because you want to believe so badly that that's true. You want to see that dynamic expressed in that narrative. You want to believe that they love each other, and that's specifically why they're acting that way. And to some extent, you feel a little bit of fear. Fear that, once again, it will be wax. That there is nothing real there, only a plausibly deniable illusion of queerness that lures you in, but not explicitly enough to turn away homophobes. And a big part of the reason why queerbaiting sucks is twofold. First, you feel tricked. You feel stupid. You feel like you've lost at chess against a dog, even when you should have known better than to think any of this would be real. Falling for queerbaiting makes you feel like Charlie Brown, sailing through the air after Lucy pulled the football away for the billionth time, wondering why you keep believing her when she says that she won't. The second part, though, is that you feel used, manipulated, exploited. You feel like an author has deliberately and cynically used your identity to draw you in with the intent of telling you to fuck off as soon as they've gotten your money. It feels mean-spirited, like a straight boy pretending to be into you for a prank just to pull the rug out from you to hurt your feelings and laugh about it with his friends. And given how closely people cling to their representation and how much they can connect with these characters, it does kind of feel like having your heart broken in that uniquely queer way. Like having a crush on a straight person who really can't reciprocate. Like, it feels very good luck, babe, you know? But unlike in the real world, you can't ask a video game or a book or movie or TV show a follow-up. If you have a crush on a straight boy, you can ultimately get an answer to that question by asking and letting your dreams be crushed so you can move on. Or even if you can't ask for any number of reasons, there is a truth that could be uncovered with a real human being. There is an answer. With fiction, there's only really three options here. Either 1, explicitly queer, 2, unconfirmed queer but queer-coded, and 3, explicitly queerbaited. For the first and third option, it's pretty easy to answer about what happens. You either get what you want or you feel tricked. The challenge with the ones in that middle option is that it ultimately comes down to you. Situations like Gihyuk and Doyon are ones where it ultimately comes down to the audience's individual interpretation, and there's no clear right or wrong way to approach it. That's part of the purpose of ambiguity in the narrative. That's part of what gives it meaning, is that not every question can be answered, and you get to go home and think about it later. You get to sit at home, go to bed, and still have these scenes playing in your mind thinking, what does that mean? And to be clear, assuming heterosexuality by default is barely more valid than assuming queerness, if more at all. After all, yes, that is the majority group, but statistics don't really work like that. Statistically, roughly 1 in every 20 people is gay, and an even smaller proportion of the population are trans. But if you try and apply those statistics to a Drag Race viewing party or the listening audience of Sophie, you're going to make mistakes, right? Averages are just that, averages. Roughly 1 in every 20 or so people will be gay, but that doesn't mean that for every gay person there have to be 19 straight people in their immediate proximity. It's just not how things work. Then again, even if you can rationalize it, it can also be hard to get past the nagging voice that you're just coping, that you're either hallucinating the queerness altogether or are falling for queerbaiting and are just in denial. And what happens then? Well, you ultimately have to decide what the point of the fruitiness is for yourself. Do you need to take a bite out of that apple to get what you want out of it? Or is it enough for your own sake to just believe that it's real? After all, if nobody ever gets to bite it, then nobody knows for sure whether it's wax or not. Is it so wrong to choose to believe it's real? And is it less wrong to choose to believe it's fake? Queer representation is challenging because it's a lot easier for it to be ambiguous, but that ambiguity doesn't mean heterosexuality until proven otherwise. It means ambiguity. The whole framing of queerbaiting assumes that not only the character is not queer, but that there was a deliberate attempt to trick you that you fell for. And I think we tend to overprescribe queerbaiting when it is more complicated than that. Falling for queerbaiting implies that you fell for a trick, but if a character is ambiguously presented in a scenario where it makes logical and narrative sense for sexuality to not come up, and there are plenty of indicators in favor, is it really queerbaiting? Do you need the characters to declare it explicitly in order to accept it? Some people would say it's just fiction, so who cares? They're not real people. They're not real representation. They're a product, a narrative, a set of pixels on the screen. But fiction does still matter. It doesn't have to be literally real to mean something real to you. We've been over this already in the Danganronpa V3 video. What you choose to take away from a piece of media is your choice. Sure, there are limits, especially if you're wanting to actually engage in discourse. If something goes against all evidence, it's an interpretation that's unlikely to be widely adopted or taken seriously. But there's a lot of no man's land between absolutely no evidence and confirmed fruitcake. How you choose to navigate it, interpret it, analyze it, and engage with it is up to you. You have autonomy here. You can choose to believe you got queerbaited by Doyoon and Gi-hyuk never making out on screen, that apple was ultimately wax all along and that you fell for the trick. Or you can choose to believe the fruit was real. You don't get to take a bite either way, really, and no one's using their authorial intent to tell you otherwise, so why should I have to accept that my interpretation is wrong when no conflicting interpretations can be established? Or at least confirmed, canonized. Why should a queer analysis of these characters be considered queerbaiting in any scenario where they don't just turn to screen and announce their sexuality? Why is it straight until proven otherwise? And to be clear, I'm not saying that it's a bad thing for queerness to be explicitly declared. I think it's good when it is represented and it is unapologetic. But fans of this channel will be well acquainted with how it is possible for a character to be both explicitly queer and also an awful bigoted portrayal of queer identities. If I have to accept Sasha Smith and Giovanni Lombardi as queer characters, then I get to have Doyoon and Gi-hyuk too. If I choose to believe that the apple is real based on a rational, logical interpretation of the facts presented to me, that the fictional characters are in fact boy kissers, then why should I have to accept that I've been tricked in some way when there's no proof of a trick? Why label it as queerbaiting? What good is served by that framework, that implicit queerness is a trick until explicitly declared? Why should I be expected to assume that any portrayal of queerness that I identify with is me being a dumb idiot that got duped just because it wasn't being accompanied by gay flashing on the screen in big text? That's not to say it isn't important to be able to identify queerbaiting when it happens. Only to say that this jump to assume things like buried stars are just queerbaiting comes from a place that's based in some flawed assumptions and perceptions of queerness, both from queer people and cishet people. Think of it this way. If someone describes an apple to you, things like its color, size, shape, is it being rational to assume that it's wax unless they specifically tell you it is? I mean, sure, if they say it's wax, it's probably best not to take a bite, and it's possible that they're lying and hiding that fact so that you do. But I choose to go through the world believing that people aren't just trying to cynically trick me whenever they pull out an apple. I don't think it's healthy to go through life, or even just through media, with the assumption that everyone's actively seeking to pull the rug out from under you. And yes, you'll sometimes get tricked, and it sucks. But when someone describes an apple to me, I don't think I have anything to gain from assuming it's wax by default when there's no way to prove it either way.
내가 그렇게 호감상도 아니잖아.
네가 뭐 어때서? 혹시 너 자길 포커페이스라고 생각하는 건 아니지?
조금은 그렇지 않나?
그래. 그럼 그렇다고 칠게. 포커페이스. 내가 널 읽었다고 생각하면 되지.
내가 무슨 책이야, 읽게?
어? 혹시 기분 나빴어?
또 읽어봐. 지금 딱 포커페이스니까.
Anyways, that's the end of the video. Congratulations on making it this far. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more. I'm working on some other videos that were supposed to be out for Pride, but got delayed on account of that V3 video, and those should be out next week. So if this is your thing, you should check those out as well. Also, reminder that the Wiggler pin pre-orders are still going on, and you don't want to miss out. We're super close to getting to the goal, so if you're interested, make sure to check out the top link in the description. Also, the August Members' Choice poll is wrapping up today. The topics are what it means to hate a game for content, a video that would explore the incentives of being a hater in the gaming content creation space and how it affects you, the audience you develop, and your own relationships with games and gaming at large. How Buried Stars Gets Social Media Toxicity Right, a video that would be a return to Buried Stars focusing specifically on how it portrays social media toxicity through its Twitter stand-in Fader, and how that toxicity impacts each of the characters differently. Why Blizzard's cosmetics surveys are inherently flawed, a video that would examine the fundamental flaws of Blizzard's approach to surveying the Overwatch community when it comes to actually understanding what that audience wants, and what we can learn from this failure. What does it mean to perform poorly, a video that would be about how we evaluate performance and how our understanding of performance metrics is counterintuitive, both in gaming spaces and beyond. If you're interested in voting for one of these, you can become a channel member starting at $5 a month on YouTube or Patreon. Links to both are in the description. Channel members get to pick one video a month, and the video that you just watched is one that they picked back in May. I'm still working my way through the backlog of videos, but I'm hoping to get caught up ASAP. And channel members are a huge part of why I'm able to keep making videos like this in the first place, so their support is always greatly appreciated. Speaking of, thank you to all my channel members, including everyone who was a member back when this topic was first chosen. At the $25 Elite membership tier, thank you to Adele and Robot Juice. At the $10 premium membership tier, thank you to Tortoise, Anja Tenar, A Ghost Bat, Bailey Nichols, and Cavi Corbin. At the $5 channel membership tier, thank you to Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Destiny, Miniq, Cadence, Marsh Alice, Gavos, Crimson Cyclo, Good Guy Luis, Corey, MV, The Only Enigma, Mariah, Amon Dowdley, Meep Cubed, Noisy Pitta, Harv, Marcy Gaskill, Deku _ Safon, Lala the Bambi, JMD Toaster, Ginkgo, Monica Linnell, and Teo Tamara. Whether you're a channel member, a subscriber, or you just clicked on this video out of curiosity, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.